Hi, everybody. We're going to get started even as some people filter in. I'm Joshua Lynn. I'm the co-founder and CEO of RepresentUs. And hi to people attending virtually as well. One of the things that's most interesting to me about being at an international conference on democracy is, first of all, I think we have a lot to learn from democracy around the world. Hence the panel of experts here to discuss today what we're going to learn from democracies around the world. One thing that pertains uniquely to me and RepresentUs is our organization actually is founded to answer the question, what would it take to make America the world's strongest democracy, the country that we live in? If there's anybody here from Finland, Norway, New Zealand tuning in, you all are the top 3 in the world and what the rest of us should aspire to be. And so as you're watching and participating, I would ask you to also ask, do you want your country to be a stronger democracy? Isn't that something that we're all actually striving for? With that in mind, I do want to tell you a tiny bit about RepresentUs, but quickly get to our panel of experts because they're who we're here to actually talk with. So RepresentUs is a fiercely nonpartisan organization. We bring folks together from across the political spectrum to build an American democracy movement specifically focused on passing reforms in cities and states across the country to tackle things like gerrymandering, to pass ranked choice voting and open primaries to open up that process, and to fight corruption through ethics, transparency, and campaign finance reforms in America. Part of the reason we focus on the states is that Congress, no offense to anybody here, but has been very stuck on anti-corruption reform in America. And so what we found is we can get a lot of traction locally, and in the states we've had 170 victories in the last 10 years since we launched this organization. So I really want to underscore that today's session is actually about discussing solutions, right? I think everybody understands the problem. Voters are constantly polled, and do you think democracy is under threat? Something like 73 to 76% of voters, depending on the poll, now says that American democracy is under great threat, and a massive portion of those say that it's because of money in politics, corruption, the topics of the day. So I'm going to encourage all of you to participate. If you have questions, we've got an intimate group here in the crowd. If you want to jump in, I won't be offended. We do have people submitting questions via chat on the World Wide Web, and we'll take some of those as well. And with that, I'm going to go right into introductions. So first, Cliff Albright is the co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund and the Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute, which builds community and organizational capacity related to black voting power. Over the past 5 years, Cliff and BVM have traveled the country in, quote, the blackest bus in America, energizing voters and exposing voter suppression. Cliff has several degrees from Cornell, an MBA from the University of Alabama, and was a 2020 Soros Equality Fellow. Cliff has contributed articles to several well-known publications and appears on CNN, MSNBC, the BBC, and other networks. Thanks for being here, Cliff. Laura Williamson is an Associate Director of Policy and Research at Demos. She researches, develops, and advocates for policies that address discrimination and advance racial equity in voting. And she partners with grassroots and national organizations on campaigns that advance multiracial, inclusive democracy, something we're going to talk about here today. She holds an MPA from Princeton, the School of Public and International Affairs, and a BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thanks for being here, Laura. Lee Drutman, over here to my right, is the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, the case for multi-party democracy in America. He's a senior fellow at the think tank New America, a lecturer at Johns Hopkins, and the co-host of the podcast Politics in Question. He's also the co-founder of a new organization called Fix Our House, which is a campaign for proportional representation here in America. He writes the newsletter that we should all sign up for called Undercurrent Events. Thanks for being here, Lee. We have Marissa Teresa Kumar from Voto Latino. She's the founding president, is an American activist and social entrepreneur, and an Emmy-nominated MSNBC contributor seeking to shake up the political process. They leverage youth, technology, social platforms, and influencers. Voto Latino reaches 6.5 million people monthly. They are a key civic engagement organization and in the past election registered 1.2 million voters. Maria. What did I say? Marissa. Maria Teresa, thank you. I appreciate the correction. Okay, lastly, Voto Latino registered 15% of new Texas voters. That's impressive. Thanks for being here, Maria. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Miles Taylor, a public policy leader, best-selling author, and the current executive director of the Renew America movement, a pro-democracy organization based in DC. Previously, Miles was Google US lead for advanced technology and security strategy. He's responsible for promoting next-generation cyber defense, digital security, and innovation in areas such as quantum computer and artificial intelligence, as well as the company's head of national security policy engagement. Prior to Google, Taylor worked as the former chief of staff at the US Department of Homeland Security, where he oversaw day-to-day operations of the government's third largest department. He is author of the book, A Warning, a firsthand account of the instability inside President Trump's White House and administration, which topped the New York Times bestseller list. Miles, thanks for joining us. Okay, starting question, and whoever just feels the most excited about this one can answer it. The US likes to fashion itself as number one in everything, right? American exceptionalism is such a thing that's baked into our culture, and we like to think of us as one of the world's leading beacons of freedom and democracy, and anybody who's at this conference probably knows that that's simply not true. And so while our system is currently stuck in this era of partisanship and gridlock, and we strive to be more like other countries, I want to ask you a very simple question. What is it that makes a democracy strong? And what is it that's happening right now that is causing schisms and the fall of democracy and sort of the faltering of democracy across the world? Any takers?
I'm always happy to do the doom and gloom question.
Yeah.
So.
Well, let's start with the positive one. What makes democracy strong?
No. I'm going to start with why it's so bad right now. I think we've all had the conversation at the dinner party and the cookout about social media and why things are so extreme. I want to give you a little bit different spin on that, not to disagree with that schema, but to tell you about how I view it from a national security perspective. I spent most of my career making myself totally unqualified for this panel by working on counterterrorism. That's what I've done in most of my career, is focus on groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, spent a lot of time in the Middle East, spent time tracking these groups and trying to thwart international terror plots. But there's a big lesson to be learned when we look at violent extremist groups around the world as a proxy for what we're seeing with democratic gridlock and democratic backsliding. And that is, most of those movements that we've studied throughout history have their genesis in a complaint among a fringe political group that the system itself doesn't offer an outlet for their views. So it starts with a grievance. It starts with a grievance that the existing political structure will not provide an opportunity for people to express their views. Those grievances are then exploited by conspiracy theories that further justify that narrative. And then it's pretty easy for folks to jump the tracks from disaffection and conspiracy theories into violence. Now, this is something that post 9/11, I thought I would just spend a whole career focusing abroad on where those challenges were happening. We're seeing, at least if we use the United States as an example of this backsliding, we're seeing the exact same phenomena happen here domestically, where again, it starts with a grievance and then moves into conspiracy theories. So let me, don't believe me, let me just attach some data to it really quickly that exemplifies this, and would love to pass to another panelist. Let's take what everyone knows, the Donald Trump big lie after the 2020 election. It was an observably stupid statement, not believable, fringe conspiracy theory that the election was stolen. I say that with firsthand knowledge. I was responsible for overseeing election security in 2020 for the federal government. I can tell you it was the most safe, the most secure election in modern history. Nevertheless, Donald Trump said it wasn't, said it was stolen. When we look back now 2 years later, 75% of Republican voters still believe that conspiracy theory, that the process was undermined. 50% of Republican voters, according to Pew, believe in the core tenets of the QAnon conspiracy theory, that the government is operated by a secret cabal of people in Washington, and that Democrats run secret, high-profile child sex predator rings and drink the blood of children. This is all QAnon. 50% of Republican voters in this country subscribe to those core tenets. And then third, another 50% believe in the Great Replacement theory, that people of other countries, quote unquote, the third world, are being imported into the United States to change the makeup of the white electorate. So those conspiracy theories have gone from far fringe to mainstream. What would we predict happens after that? Well, we would predict an uptick in political violence. And we've seen precisely that. We've seen attitudes towards political violence in the United States surge, so much so that 1 in 10 Americans now think violence is justified now against the government. 1 in 4 believe it's probably justified at some point. And a survey about a year ago showed that 10% of Americans believe Donald Trump should be forcibly reinstalled into the White House. So why are we seeing these threats to democracy? Because I believe that the increasing extremism and polarization is driving those conspiracy theories and driving people to say, well, democracy doesn't represent me and my views, so I have to go around the system.
So I want to use that as a place to pick up and actually address another topic that we're going to get to. And Lee, I think we'll start with you on this, but we're seeing the fringism, we're seeing these missing outlets for conspiracies and other views. And I think one of the questions is, do third, fourth, and fifth parties start to address this and create an outlet for that that could reduce political violence? And to get to the topic of today, are other countries more successful in mitigating extremism because of their multi-party democracy?
Well, yes, I think so. But I think we have to step back. I'll address your first question, Miles, kind of set up what can go wrong. So what makes a democracy strong? I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to come at this with a somewhat academic-y perspective, but my basic view is that democracy is a system for managing and resolving conflicts. That politics is about conflict because things that are political issues are things that we can't agree on otherwise. And one way to manage conflict is through violence and force. Another way is through negotiation and compromise and elections. So the question to me is, well, what kinds of democracies are able to resolve conflicts in society, and what kind of democracies are not? And I think there's an answer that we've known for a long time. The answer goes back to Madison and Federalist number 10, and the answer is basically that you don't break politics into us versus them. That you have fluid factions in which different coalitions form on different issues, and diversity of life experience, diversity of opinion, stands in for neutrality, because in order to have any societal agreement, you need to build a big coalition that crosses a lot of people. Now, this was Madison writing in Federalist Papers a long time ago. This is something that political scientists and social psychologists have come to over and over again. A lot of people in the mid-20th century were trying to understand how political violence could happen in the wake of horrible genocides throughout the first half of the 20th century. And the answer that they came up with was, it's kind of a wonky political science term of cross-cutting cleavages, but it's basically this idea that all societies are diverse, right? I mean, a society in which everybody is unified and everybody agrees is either a totalitarian society when everybody's brainwashed, or is a world of one. But when people's identities cross and different partisan lines, and not everything feels zero-sum, and if your side wins, then my side loses, and if your side wins, I don't see anything about me in government. This is what Miles was getting at, is that when extremism comes from feeling like the system is not legitimate, like people like me are not represented, are systematically pushed aside from government, and that I have no shot of being part of a governing, ruling coalition. So this is a long and academic way of saying that part of if you look at democracies that are failing, almost always what you see before that failure is a division of society into an us and a them around a very narrow winner-take-all election. Political scientist Jennifer McCoy and Murat Summer call this pernicious polarization. See it happening in Hungary, and Turkey, and Venezuela, and other countries that have had recent democratic collapses that had previously been, somewhat democratic. And it happens when politics becomes binary. So I think the one thing that you see in political systems that have more parties is that politics becomes less binary. Parties come in and out of coalitions with each other. People are not segregated into entirely different communities in which all of their identities are reinforced through partisanship. And so to the extent that we can break the binary psychology of us versus them, the winner-take-all logic of trying to dominate the other side through having multiple parties, I think that makes democracy more likely to sustain itself, particularly in a diverse society, multi-ethnic, multiracial society, but I mean, really in any society. I mean, it requires a large amount of societal consensus in order for a binary two-party system not to devolve into that. And now you might say—
Lee, I want to jump in on the difference between the two-party kind of binary in our politics versus the actual diversity of the United States, because there's an interesting argument that's currently being made. A book was published this year alleging that one of the big concerns with American democracy, or not concerns, one of the challenges that we have is that actually homogeneous countries have an easier time managing their democracy because there's less diversity of thought, there's less diversity of race, ideal, culture. And I'm curious, how do you think about, Maria Teresa, how do you think about the distinction between what is currently a two-party duopoly versus a very vibrant and diverse America that quite actually makes us stronger?
Well, I think that the three countries that you just mentioned are all homogeneous of failed democracies, right? You mentioned Turkey, Venezuela, and Hungary. So I would set that aside and say, actually, we are living in a modern era where it does not actually, that division actually does not actually apply to the United States. And I would also further, encourage us to look at the fact that when we see what has happened in the last two election cycles in the United States is a diverse America across socioeconomics that have risen against the authoritarian one system who's comfortable with one system rule. And it didn't happen by accident in 2018, it didn't happen by accident in 2020, and it didn't happen by accident in 2022. If you look at every single Secretary of State where there was an election denier in a battleground state, that person lost marvelously. Because there are independent and moderate white voters that didn't feel comfortable with this idea of winner take all. And when you actually look at a multicultural America, and this is right now, is our values are aligned, I would say, and this is gonna be slightly controversial, it's what we're seeing right now in the United States is very much the battle of generations, where you have an older generation that does not necessarily espouse the same values of the largest generation of Americans that happens to be multicultural. And I'm talking about, I don't need to sit down with a young person and convince them that climate change is real. I don't have to have a conversation with them and convince them that agency over my body is okay as a woman. I don't have to convince the majority of them that it doesn't matter who gets married to whom. And we are right now living in a moment in American democracy that is absolutely the fight for which direction the country is going to go. But it is because of that we're an incredible opportunity, because the majority of Americans want to fix our system. For the last 18 months, I've been speaking with Brookings Institute and Harvard University trying to find, how do you modernize our election system for the 21st century? How do we modernize our democracies? And you mentioned New Zealand, you mentioned Australia, there's Finland. And one of the things that we learned is by universal voting, you actually create a system where everybody participates. To what you were saying, is like the more participation of a system, it's harder to polarize someone, because I, as a candidate, have to convince everybody in this room that my policy is better than his by meeting in the middle. And that is the appetite, I think, that we saw in the 2022 election of the majority of Americans, even in the closest of elections, saying the system is not perfect to meet our needs of the 21st century, but it doesn't mean that we step away. There's now a moment to actually socialize this idea of modernization.
And Laura, we were talking about this a little bit before, the connection between universal voting and what are the things that other countries do to encourage people to vote, to make it more appealing, to incentivize voting, and how can the federal government be part of that as pertains to universal voting or just having more people participate?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and I agree, Maria Teresa, with that analysis. And in particular, we'll say that the concept of universal voting, where everyone is required to vote, is a really interesting and compelling one for, I think, probably reasons that are obvious and self-evident to everybody in this room, right? We have, in the United States at least, an electorate who doesn't reflect the actual populace, and if you require everyone to vote, then the folks who are actually voting people into elected office will look far more like the actual population, and then we will have elected officials who will look far more like our people, and by extension then policies that actually work for the demos. And I should say, demos, our name means the people, comes from the root word of democracy. So anyway, I think the idea of universal voting is a really compelling one. Demos hasn't actually endorsed the idea, in part because there's some sort of important considerations, like making sure that we don't inadvertently create a system that criminalizes people for not voting, or penalizes people who are inadvertently caught up in it because they're told that they have to vote but they're not eligible. So sort of important considerations, but a really exciting idea. I mean, the other thing that we are working on right now that I think is another way that other countries and particularly advanced democracies really invite their people into the political process is by ensuring that the responsibility or the burden of getting registered to vote actually belongs on the state and not on the individual. The reality is registration, getting and staying registered, is one of the biggest barriers to voting election after election. And it's a barrier that disproportionately impacts and is harder for the same communities who are left out of our democracy. Communities of color, low-income communities, LGBTQ communities, limited English proficient communities, people with disabilities, et cetera. And that's because we've designed the system, registration in the United States at least, is born of a system to try to keep black people and immigrants from voting, and that is what it is doing today. And so in other advanced democracies, the government says, this is our responsibility. We actually want our people to vote, so we're gonna just make sure that they are already on the rolls and that that barrier to voting is no longer a barrier and they can go vote. And so that's a thing that's happening actually already in the United States as well at the state level. It has for decades. It happens at DMVs. Many of you may have been registered when you went to get your license or to update your license. It also happens at public assistance agencies, so SNAP, Medicaid, et cetera. And there's tremendous opportunity for that also to happen through federal agencies when they're interacting with the public. So this is, imagine you go to the USPS to mail something and you have the opportunity to update your registration. Or you go to apply for a passport and you update your registration. You apply for federal student aid through the FAFSA and you get a chance to register to vote. So that's a tremendous opportunity here in the United States that we can take advantage of to learn from other advanced democracies who are in fact recognizing and minimizing this barrier that registration plays to voting.
Thanks. So Cliff, one of the things that's been interesting to me so far in this conversation is not only the comparison between American democracy and the tools we use to have registered voters, but I also think it's really interesting that there's this dichotomy between failing democracies that are non-diverse, very unilateral, and also flourishing democracies that are more homogeneous. And I'm curious, how do you see that applying to your work? How do you see the overlap between voter registration, parties, and having a multilateral democracy?
Yeah, in answering that, let me just offer, that most people know me and my organization for the work that we do domestically. Many, many moons ago, when I first came out of grad school, my first graduate degree was actually in Africana Studies, specializing in Southern Africa, and my first jobs coming out of grad school were actually in international development with the World Bank and USAID, and so a lot of my perspective about, this comparative political systems comes out of that experience. And speaking of which, I was reading something just a couple of months ago that was saying, it was looking at African countries that have recently been redesigning their constitutions because, of course, many of the original constitutions were really just remnants of colonial systems, right? And so, but it was looking at how those countries that had proportional representation, multi-party systems, we're prone to less political violence, to Lee's point, right? When it's not a winner take all, when it's not a us versus them, when there's more opportunity structurally for more people and more parties to participate, then you don't have as much violence, right? Like, common sense, right? And so, but it's interesting that that's a hard discussion to start in this country because of those feelings of American exceptionalism, that there is no other way other than the American way, another way that we've always done things. And so we've got some barriers to being able to have a more healthy, less prone to violent political system. Some of those violence are because we have a winner-take-all system. We don't have proportional representation. Some of it is because that we've got challenging ballot access laws, right? Even if you had a proportional representation system, you've got ballot access. In other words, how do independent parties, third parties, other parties, minor parties even get on the ballot? Back in 2006, me along with some other organizers in Alabama actually started a third party in Alabama. You could do so at the county level in the state of Alabama. The problem was, in order to stay on the ballot, so we actually had ballot access, was called the Freedom Party. It was built on the experience of Stokely Carmichael and SNCC organizers in Alabama with the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. So we got on the ballot, and our symbol was a black woman. It wasn't a donkey and it wasn't an elephant. It was a black woman, right? This was years before Black Girl Magic, but it was a black woman. And so we got on the ballot, but to stay on the ballot, we had to get 20% of the vote. And we wound up getting 18 yes. And so, not 2%, not 1%, we had to get 20% of the vote. And as I said to the chair of the Republican Party at the time, when he called up the day after the election teasing us, saying, oh, you couldn't get your 20%. I said, well, Brock, his name was Brock. I said, Brock, with the Republican Party, y'all been around for 200 years and you still can't get 20% in Dallas County. So, but the point is that in some states or jurisdictions, it is hard to either get ballot access or to maintain ballot access. That's a structural issue that we have got to add into the discussion. And then along with those first two, of course, the issue of funding, campaign finance reform, the cost of being a party that can actually run an election, get on the ballot, and to win seats. So we've got all of these structural issues that work on top of the other just bare, like, race discrimination, felony disenfranchisement, all the big lie, and all these things that we're facing in terms of, like, even getting a Voting Rights Act that is actually functional and that the Supreme Court won't gut. And so we've got these traditional voting rights issues, and then we've got these democratic reform issues. And if we could deal with both those universes of policies, we might actually be able to sustain a functional democracy.
So I want to go back to national security in just a second, and I have a question for you, Miles. But I'm curious because you brought up your experience with Africa and studying multiple democracies there. Based on what you just described, if you could borrow one or two of the things that you see written into newer constitutions now, based on everything we know from hundreds of years of studying constitutions and your work, what would be your top one or two choices?
Yeah, I think it definitely proportional representation would be at the top of my list, right?
Have you met Lee?
Right, nice to meet you, Lee. But that would be at the top of my list. The questions around universal voting, making it easier for more people to have access to the vote, making Election Day a national holiday. Amen. Right? I mean, that's not rocket science. And so there's some very easy fixes if you are in a society that truly values access to the vote, not disenfranchising people because they've got a felony conviction. That's something that is particularly rooted in the history of slavery and racism in this country. And so there's some very basic things that I would suggest. So you asked for one thing, I just gave you 3 or 4.
That's great.
Proportional representation, making it easier for more people to vote. Automatic voter registration, not putting the burden on individuals to have to get registered, but the default should be that you are registered, that you come of age, whatever that age is, but you come of age, and the default is that you are registered.
Now, Maria, you picked up your microphone. Do you want to add?
No, I think something that you're saying, I think, is one of the challenges. I know oftentimes when I travel abroad and have conversations, people say, well, why this reemergence of Jim Crow laws? And it has everything to do with the diversity of America. and the coming of age of America that is incredibly diverse. And what I mean by that is one of the best underreported conversations around the gutting of the Supreme Court, of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, of Shelby County versus Eric Holder, was that Shelby County, 3 years prior in the census of 2010, had experienced an over 290% increase in the Latino population. 290%. 93% in the African American population. That collectively you actually see these massive shifts that no one's talking about. And this is a fun fact for the folks in the room. If I were to put a plot graph here and say, what is the most common age of whites in America? It's 58 years old. The most common age among African Americans is roughly 32 years old. Who can tell me the most common age of Latinos in this country? 11.
Wow.
And so the systems, the structural systems of anti-democratic governance is happening at the local level has everything to do with the demographic shifts that people aren't prepared for. And that's cowardly.
Do we see these same patterns abroad as cities, states, nations diversify?
When I say that we're talking about generational shifts, we're talking about, I have 2 kids that are the alpha generation. They are 10 and they are 8 years old. They represent in this country the majority minority, meaning that there's no bigger group than, they're all basically, everyone's equal. But however, that alpha generation represents the largest generation of a population worldwide. Mm-hmm. And so these cleavages, what I believe we're seeing across the globe, are cleavages between an older generation and younger generations, fighting for resources that were promised to them, but that they do not have access to.
It's such an interesting take because there is, I think it doesn't get said enough, and I really strongly agree that there is this inherent promise that clearly is not just American, but that we will have what our parents had or more, right? And we don't often talk about that promise not paying off. We've seen it. In 2008, there was the big crash. It was a moment where we all talked about it, but since then, it's been kind of under the radar. And I think it's very smart to say that that's fueling some of the disturbances in all of the systems. Which brings me to this question of political violence. And Miles, this is maybe a tricky one, but I think it's right in your wheelhouse. So I'm curious, we've talked a lot about what I hear as the theory behind multi-party democracy, how nations deal with the diversity within their nation. And we're kind of suggesting that there's a connection there to a reduction in political violence and a strengthening of representation. But I'm curious if you know, are there examples of that happening around the world where we see a direct correlation, if not causation, between better representation through diverse democracy to reduce political violence?
That is a really good question. Lee has got like 30 stats in his head on this. I will say something though. I mean, Maria said this earlier. I think we're seeing, back to the question of homogeneity, which is similar, that distinction has been erased. You see a highly homogenous North Korea and a highly homogenous Iranian state and a highly homogenous Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, which are among the most democratic. I've just mentioned among the most autocratic. So I don't think that distinction is there. More pluralistic democracies in terms of parties, I think probably correlate loosely to lower political violence. But one, this is tied in a sense to this, and I want to ask a question of this audience, and you'll see why it's tied to it in a second. And that is, I want to know what you guys in the room think roughly the average approval rating is of the U.S. Congress in the United States. What's the average approval rating that Americans say of their Congress? Someone throw out a number. 12, 20? Okay, 20 is about right. Sometimes it's gone as low as 12, but usually it's about 20%. Not very good, pretty bad. Imagine that you were going to the store and buying soap, and only 20% of people like their soap options. Okay, now I'm gonna give you another question. What percentage of incumbent members of Congress win re-election? What's the re-election rate? If you're already in your seat, what's your likelihood of being re-elected on average? Even higher than that. 90 to 95% of incumbents get reelected. So imagine any marketplace where the majority of consumers said, my products are shit. I don't like my choices. But then, that's all they have. Nothing else enters the marketplace, and the soap keeps on selling, the 2 options of soap. This ends up having, and it has ended up having, a very pernicious impact on American civil stability in the country, but also, as a result, the types of people we're seeing in Congress. So Josh has heard me tell this before. I'm going to tell a very quick story. And I want you to look at this desk, and Josh knows the story I'm going to tell. When I first went to Capitol Hill, I was a congressional page, a little messenger. For 200 years, there's been these messengers that run around the House and deliver, notes as couriers for the members of Congress. And I sat at a desk like this. And that was just after 9/11. And it was in a time period where Pew indicated that roughly 100 members of Congress in our House of 435 qualified as moderates. And to me, it was a really cool lesson in civics, as I got to sit behind this little desk on the floor of the House of Representatives, the front row seat of democracy, and see members of Congress literally cross the aisle to do bills. There was quite a few moderates working together. That was more than 20 years ago. On January 6th, 2021, you all have probably seen the famous photo of the congressional chamber being stormed by insurrectionists, and there's this photo of these Capitol Secret Service officers in suits with guns pointed at the door, blocking insurrectionists from coming in the chamber. And guess what was blocking those doors? They had moved the page desk over in front of the doors. That desk I sat at in that unifying time in American politics was the last line of defense from that door getting kicked open. And guess how many people Pew said were moderates in Congress in that time period? 12. They rated 12 members of Congress as moderates. I give you that example because there is a direct correlation between people who are willing to work across the aisle, Americans perceiving the system as responsive to them, and then getting to a point where they no longer think there are moderates cutting deals, they no longer think they're represented, and of course, the upshot of that is people trying to actually storm that chamber. So a long way of answering your question, Josh, but I think that we end up seeing a tighter correlation between increasing partisanship and political violence than we do necessarily in terms of homogeneity or diversity, and part of that then ties to political parties, which Lee could probably say a lot about.
Go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, so there's a lot I want to pick up on here. I want to just, you mentioned a book saying it's hard for diverse democracies to thrive. That's Yascha Monck's book, The Great Experiment, which I reviewed in the Washington Post, in my review. And I point out that New Zealand and Canada and Botswana and Ghana are all diverse democracies that have thrived. And frankly, if you look at the studies that many comparative political scientists have done, diversity doesn't necessarily contribute to poor democracy. And we've had multi-ethnic, multiracial democracies for a long time. So the idea that we're in this great experiment seems to me a bit of a canard. And to Maria Teresa's point, I mean, China is a homogenous society. You can. I mean, there's a lot of homogenous societies that are not successful democracies. But when you get to the point of violence, these studies say, well, it's not how diverse the society is, it's how that diversity fits with the political system. So when you have a system that divides people into two and makes every election essentially just a head count, it tells people where they are, where their status is in society. And if their side is losing, that means that heads, that means that they're going to be in the minority, and in a winner-take-all system, we know what happens to minorities. Now, Civil War, violence, party systems. Barbara Walter has I guess maybe it's been out for about a year, a book on how civil wars start. And she notes in that book that no country with proportional representation has had a civil war in her database. All the civil wars have been in countries that have had majoritarian political systems because they heighten the conflict. Now, I want to make an addendum on Miles' point about the low approval rating of Congress and the incumbent re-election rate, because it actually is striking. Not a single, now that Warnock has won, not a single Senate incumbent lost in this election, which was as far as I can tell, the first election in U.S. history where not a single senator who was an incumbent lost. So only one seat flipped, Pennsylvania. Only 7 House incumbents lost. Only 1 governor lost. So people are very dissatisfied with politics, but what they're even more dissatisfied by is the thought of the other side winning, which is really striking. Now, we have a low approval rating of Congress, but this is you know, I'm going to say a point about corruption, because this is at a corruption conference, and I think by saying we're anti-corruption in the U.S. and pointing the finger at corruption, it makes an easy excuse that it's very easy for individual members to run against Washington and say, Washington is broken and I'm going to go there and fix it. We have this narrative that everything in politics is corrupt, parties are corrupt, and you asked at the beginning about what do strong democracies have in common? They have strong political parties. Partisanship is a part of democracy, and the idea that we're going to do things that are nonpartisan and anti-corruption is politics in the negative. It's not about building power, it's about smashing up power, and I think we really need to think long and hard in the kind of anti-corruption space. I mean, I know there are countries that are much more corrupt in the world, and this in an international context, it's a little different. But sometimes we spend so much time running against government and treating government and power as inherently corrupt that we don't think about how we build collective institutions that organize and channel power. And I think that's an incredibly important thing for us all to be thinking about.
So I think Maria Teresa and Cliff, you both looked like you had something to add on here, and then I have a follow-up question for you.
I have a question.
Oh, please.
I am Brazilian, and there is it's like Steve Bannon created worldly a thing. It's a thing. Because what you see people doing there is irrational. It's like, you cannot explain. So, what the hell is going on with democracy and with this kind of, because it's not the Republicans, this is a kind of a crazy breed that appeared from somewhere and have all these lonely people that decided they belong to some kind of cult. Because it's more closer to a cult than to any political party that what's going on in the world. Like, they shoot trucks in Brazil because, okay, here you have problems, but in Brazil, remember, you don't have boundaries. So what you have here in Brazil, you have 1 million times over regarding violence and all this stuff. They're killing people. They killed a priest.
Yeah, and I think, what you're seeing right now it's good that you bring up Brazil and you mentioned Steve Bannon, because what most folks don't know is about 2 years ago, Steve Bannon, in partnership with folks that fund Bolsonaro's government and campaigns and stuff, built a satellite operation to disseminate disinformation through all of Latin America, something that you were flagging. And so we started doing disinformation tracking after 2016. And it is absolutely right, connected, and it's a concerted effort, and it is a very limited amount of players. And you're asking why Brazil? Well, it's one of the largest countries in the Western Hemisphere that can immediately destabilize the United States, and that's not being slow. If you see what's happening in Mexico right now, in 2016, RTI, Russia Today, also established a satellite. You listen to how the president of Mexico speaks about providing support for Putin during the Ukraine invasion. It is a different concerted effort that we may not have time for, but it is why when President Biden speaks about autocracy versus democracy in the 21st century, he is recognizing that the world right now is in disarray and we are trying to figure out how to find our bets. I deeply believe that it was the invasion of Putin into Ukraine that made many moderate Republicans in this country and moderate Americans decide that it was their vote either to stay home or to cast a ballot for the Democrats to help safeguard here. But I do think that when we start talking about this asymmetric, there's violence in our political systems because of a rise of disgruntledness in our parties. We are being dishonest by making it sound like it is symmetrical. between the extreme liberals of this country and the right. It is not. It is one party that has been controlled by a cult that has a very different world order and vision of what America is supposed to be. And they're perfectly comfortable with authoritarianism and fascism. They're perfectly comfortable with the South African apartheid system. And that is why when you see how do you resolve this, I deeply believe is the last 3 elections have demonstrated a multicultural of America coming forth and saying that's not what we're going to do. But it's because we have to figure out how to safeguard our democracy in the next, I would say, 2 election cycles, because otherwise the fascists will win.
Go ahead, Cliff.
Yeah, and I think that question relates to when I first picked up my mic. It was something that Lee said, but because we've used the term diversity, right? And inherently, what we're talking about is we're talking about racial ethnic diversity, right? Because the reality is that in every country, in every society, there's different types of diversity, right? There's geographic diversity. In fact, a lot of this country's political system was based off of calculations between how certain geographies could be balanced out, right? You got class diversity. There's other diversities, but the default that we're usually talking about is really bottom line racial ethnic diversity, right? And I think what we've got to reckon with is that's a choice that certain people have made in order to take advantage, to elevate that as the defining diversity, right? As the defining feature, and then to manipulate that. That gets into the disinformation that you're talking about. What Bannon is doing is that he's going places and he's sowing these seeds to elevate certain differences, certain types of diversity that maybe have a history of always existing, maybe has been getting better in recent years, but now some things that were going in one direction are now reversing. Some diversity that was actually becoming I don't want to say more homogenous, but other types of diversity, policy diversity, right, was replacing that. But now it's being brought back to, oh, no, let's go back to that these people are racially different. And they're the reason why you're in a situation that you're in your country or in your state or whatever. And so that's something that we've really got to come to terms with, that there is a history of race, ethnicity being intentionally, disinformation, or and it's part of the debate that we're having here, and it's not really a debate, but it's part of the struggle that we're having here in the way that history is being taken out of our schools, so that we can't even talk about this history of the way that race has been used systemically. Because if we talk about it, then we might actually be able to deal with it, and we might be able to change the political system. We might be able to get to less polarization, et cetera, et cetera. But you have people who are feeding off of that. And in order to sustain it, they have to take that education process. So all these issues are connected. The way that we teach about our history, the way that we define what our diversity is, and the structures that we create that take that into account, all of that is connected.
Laura, can I ask you a follow-up question on this one? When I hear discussion about what one Steve Bannon is able to do, and that conversation goes from we're scared about what's happening in America if we're here, or we're scared about what's happening in Brazil because we're there. And then someone brilliant ties it together and says this is actually an international coordinated phenomenon attacking democracy in multiple ways from multiple venues. As somebody who works on this professionally, I hear myself asking, what can we do that is enough? And how can we take the dynamics that Cliff is speaking about and use them to our own power and our own benefit? And take that as a prompt, however you'd like, but it's a question that's sitting with me.
I mean, well, one thing that we in the United States can do is finally, like unlearn and let go of that point that you opened us with around exceptionalism, right? Like we have to get off of our high horse about American democracy, and we need to actually be doing what we're trying to do here, looking at other places and actually like talking to other people, right? Like we need to be building cross-border sort of global networks of learning and organizing and sort of power building so that we can understand what's happening in other places, and we can do what you just did, Maria. We can like understand it and learn from each other, and collectively confront the threat more effectively than any of us are right now. And I mean, I think people across the world do this a lot better already than the people in the United States do. So I think for one, just getting outside of our own silo here, at least in the United States. I mean, I think you brought up something earlier, Cliff, about how we finance our campaigns. And I think that's another thing that, at least here in the United States, we have to learn from how other democracies do it. We have a big money problem, obviously, in the United States. And it's a problem for a number of reasons. Number one, it is coming from a very, very small, tiny group of people who are corporations and mega-rich donors who are mostly white and who have a very narrow set of interests that don't align with the interests and the policy priorities and, frankly, the urgent needs of the demos, of the people. And it's a problem because it keeps our elected bodies unrepresentative. It keeps them also wealthy and white. And so I think in terms of learning from other countries and confronting this threat, one thing we should be doing is we should be figuring out how to fund our elections publicly so that it's not, again, these narrow corporate, in some cases authoritarian fascist interests who are able to handpick who goes into office and the policies that they enact because they're beholden to these folks who bankrolled their campaigns. But instead, it is actually the demos, it is the people who are able to fuel these campaigns and to elect people who will govern in their interests. And that's the thing that other democracies are doing already.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. I actually wrote down, as somebody was saying it before, this question of money in politics is so pernicious. The American people don't like it. I'm sure it's a problem around the world. Anybody in the room a fan of money in politics? Oh, say your question, I'll repeat it.
Okay, sure. I'm John Depp from TI in Ireland, and I'm particularly interested in political finance. I follow American politics as closely as I can, in large part because it's front page. So it would take you a while to translate. Sorry, I'm John Devitt from TI Ireland. I follow American news in large part because in Ireland you can't avoid it. It's sometimes front page news, so the midterms were big news at home as they were in the UK. But we have really tight party finance, political finance controls in Ireland. So you can't give more than €1,500 a year to a political candidate, no more than €2,500. The equivalent is about $2,500 in any 1 year to a political party. The bulk of funding for political parties actually comes from the state. Now I can't imagine a day with Citizens United and everything that went before where you'd have a situation where you'd have such tight controls on party financing. I know you do have controls on party financing here, but that you'd had the such strict controls on political finance, more broadly speaking, in the US in the same way you do have in my part of Europe. But what I'm really interested in is also learning from the US as well. And I'll often cite the example of the Seattle Democracy Voucher Scheme. And I think a similar initiative was rolled out in New York and abandoned years back. And I'm just wondering what potential there is for you to use what you've already, your own experience, your own good experience here in the US, both at state and federal level, and as I said, I'm interested to learn a lot more from your experience.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll actually take the first stab on this one because we were deeply involved both in Seattle and recently in Oakland, California. So for those who don't know, Seattle has a novel version of campaign finance, public funding. They're calling it democracy dollars. And the way it works is that every voter in Seattle gets 4 $25 vouchers, the same as a gift card, that they can use to support a qualified candidate of their choice. And to become a qualified candidate, you basically have to swear off different versions of big money. I won't get into the details. The outcome of this system in Seattle has been a complete diversification, not just of who funds campaigns, both geographically across the city, gender, race, ethnicity. It is completely diversified campaign funding. It has also diversified who can run for office and who can win. Now that passed in 2015. And it was seen by many experts as this very impressive novel thing that we were excited about. but there hasn't been a lot of momentum around it. And anybody who knows about movements would tell you that the first thing in a movement is fine, but it's actually the second one that creates momentum. There's a wonderful TED Talk you can look up about it someday if you want to see. It's got people dancing. The reason I bring it up is that Oakland, California just passed the same model this year. And the common thread here is that it took local political leaders, activists, academics, and funders getting together to do something about the system. And we see this same pattern around, as you said, ranked choice voting. We see it around anti-gerrymandering. We see it around automatic voter registration, that time and again in the United States anyway, the path to victory actually is through cities and states. And ultimately, and this goes back to registering women to vote for the first time. This goes back to marriage equality, the legalization of marijuana, prohibition of alcohol. It all happens city by city, state by state, and that's the lesson that we have had to learn. Does anybody want to draw a correlation here?
Can I disagree?
Yeah, please.
Just for fun. I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Please do.
There's been some interesting studies on money in politics. And I say this as like a small L libertarian, totally free government, let's implement, chaos and anarchy across the country. I'm only half kidding. But there's been the studies do absolutely show that money correlates with electoral success. That is not in doubt. So much so that I think the last cycle in 2020, candidates in the United States, I just want to guess, what percentage of the highest spending candidates won their races? Do you know? It was like 90 to 95%. So if you were the highest spending candidate in a race, you were basically going to win. Which seems to me outwardly to say, oh man, money in politics, that's the end all. But we've all probably taken data science classes. People will say in deeper studies, you go look at the crosstabs, it's also kind of just an indicator of where the voters were going to lean. Is that the candidate who ended up with the most money, the money ended up kind of being a rough proxy for the vote, if you then tied the vote share together. So the highest spending races, the candidates with the most money, well, they were also kind of loosely the candidates that were most liked. So you could instead say, if there was a tiny bit of money in the race, whoever had the most of the tiny bit of money probably would have won, because the dollars signaled which way the voters were going to go. If there was a ton of money in the race, the same thing. Now, some of that breaks down in the analysis. I would be willing to submit, and I don't know if Lee agrees with this, that there's a much tighter correlation between the level of competition in a race than there is with dollars. And so where there's less competition, there's not going to be nearly as efficient outcomes. So let me give you another data point, and I want to ask the group a question again. How many elected positions do you think there are in the entirety of the United States? Just throw out a number. 100 elected positions. Federal, state, and local, the whole kit and caboodle. 500,000 is the number. There are 500,000 elected positions in the United States. On the 2020 ballot across the country, how many of those positions, what percentage were competitive? In other words, had more than one person on the ballot? Not that bleak. 70% of those positions were not competitive races. 70% of the 500,000 elected positions in the United States had one person on the ballot. Why? It's not because of money in politics. It's not because of these other factors. It's because that race was very obviously one of the two parties had a lock on the seat. And that automatically led the competition to say, what's the point of entering this race? Because of those barriers. So that, to me, even more so than money, the lack of competition, because it's hard for competition to enter, like Cliff said, those barriers, like they had to receive 20%, make it really hard for some of those races to become competitive and discourage people from even having to go raise money in the first place to try to win those races.
Okay, would anybody like to discuss the distinction between winning elections and having outcomes that actually represent the people? As pertains to money in politics, corruption?
So, no, I mean,
Which people?
Just very briefly, I think that when we talk about where in the United States can we ever see a rise in third party, I would say it's the democratization of the small dollar donor. And that individual is the one that can create massive disruptions. And I will just use anecdotally what we saw with AOC when she went in and went against an incumbent that was exactly that, said, well, why am I going to even try to win? And it was that smaller donor. So I think that is that would unlock the stronghold between the two parties. But
Can I just add something real quickly? Because there's a connection between what y'all just said. Because I think, my pushback on the whole point about like the level of uncontested seats is, I don't think that this, and I want to make sure I got the stat right, because the uncontested, was that a general election?
That was in the general election.
Right.
You'd only have one person on the line instead of
Right.
two competing.
Right, and so yeah, but I think that part of the challenge is that like primaries matter, right? In fact, in a lot of communities where we do our work, and especially in the South, who wins that primary, and oftentimes the differences between the candidates in the primary are even more stark than the differences between the candidates in the general, if there's any differences, because it may not even be contested. So, I'd be curious about how that plays out in the primaries, because again, money may not matter in the general, but then it may very much matter during that primary.
Lee, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I want to point out a tension in this conversation here, because you were just saying about not representing the people, and Laura, you were saying the demos the people, and at the same time we're talking about the diversity and pluralism. So, I think this is a real problem in a lot of reform conversations, is that we use the people or ordinary people, and we assume that there's this like unified people versus the interest, or people versus the politicians, or people versus the money. And in reality, who are the people? Who's ordinary? That is the strength of this country, is diversity and pluralism. And by saying the people versus the interests, we're assuming that the people, capital T, capital P, is this reified, unified interest against the interest, right? It's like it just like doesn't make any sense to me when we stop and think about that.
So I guess I think that the challenge with money and power is that it's often used as a mechanism for suppressing people from participating. And the people stay home.
But which
people? And the people stay home. And I have to tell you, for a long time, I've been doing this way too long, I would have to convince young people that voting made a difference. Yeah. And I was like, trust me, guys. And they're like, but we still don't have X, Y, Z. And then in 2018, because of the mechanisms that were happening, young people came out in droves. And it was the very first time that we saw close to 20% increase in young people participation. And Americans in general, it was the first time in 100 years, it was the most participation we had had in a midterm in 100 years. And after that, we brought in the most diverse chamber in US representation. The most women, the most people of color, the most LGBTQ, the most veterans, the youngest in two generations. And then we had receipts. Because that chamber voted on 400 pieces of legislation that spoke to American values. It talked about everything from climate to police protection to choice to 400 pieces of a blueprint of American values. Then I was able to go back to constituency and say, look, we started this. Let's go back in 2020. And I'm sure that's what you were saying. Like, let's go back in 2020. And in 2020, we actually saw movement in legislation. So when we say the people, oftentimes it's more of this collective people who say, you know what, government has not worked for me or my generation or my parents' generation. But now I'm starting to see movement because my parents' insulin is now at $35, whereas before the big pharma wasn't. And I understand like this collective is not, but there are, the big money in politics is often used to suppress participation, specifically from communities of color and people who just are constantly downtrodden.
Right, I agree with that, but you're giving me a specific group of people who are underrepresented, which is not the people.
But everybody now gets access to $35 of insulin, right? Like that's, do you know what I'm saying? It's not just
I know what you're saying, but there's a lot of people who don't care about that, right? Like. There are a lot of people who have a lot of money who, whatever.
No, that's the problem.
I
Because
think
most people do vote.
So I'm going to give Cliff the last word on this particular debate, which is one that I think we're going to have over a drink. And then we have a question from the audience. And then I want you to each take a moment while he's asking his question to think of your 1 minute that you're going to give. 2 questions from the audience, and then how people can participate. Okay? And then we got to wrap.
I'll actually.
Oh, I did say that.
No, I'll defer. I'll defer.
I just wanted to build on Maria Teresa's point and some of what I've been hearing, because somehow we went from this focus on core representational issues to money in politics. You know, we've covered quite a gamut. And so I think it's important to prioritize. And one thing I haven't heard mentioned, when I think about what happened in 2018, all those pieces of legislation got passed in the House. How many have been actually passed into law? Very few, because of what is an incredibly unrepresentative and malapportioned Senate. And we haven't talked about the Senate yet, in part because all of us know how hard it is to amend our own Constitution. That was something, a very high, speaking of comparative politics, a very high threshold for constitutional amendment that the founders put in that is apparent now when you look at the rest of constitutions. Most constitutions have set up a much easier threshold for amendment. So we sort of don't talk about the Senate because it's so hard to change. But when I'm looking at the problems in our country, the role of money in politics pales in comparison to the gross malapportionment in the Senate. You literally have, I mean, Voto Latino. Think about all the Latinos that live on the west coast of the United States, and they have 6% of the representation in the Senate, 6 senators.
Yeah.
So, and I know we have to prioritize, right? Which includes what can pass, right? But I think one thing I never hear, and Lee knows that I've been on board for years now with proportional representation in the House, and we should go there, and I'm totally on board and want to push for it. If that passes, we are still stuck with the grossly malapportioned Senate. We're stuck with a 3-part veto point, right? House, Senate, and the presidency. People talk about a separation of powers. It's actually overlapping powers, and the presidency has a huge legislative role because they have veto power. So 3 bodies that legislate. One of them would be proportional. The other 2 would be, if you have the Senate and the Electoral College, would still be grossly, grossly malapportioned. So what are we doing on the other 2? We have this National Popular Vote Compact. It's being pushed in the House, or in the Senate, for the Electoral College. That's great. But the Senate, to my mind, if you're prioritizing, one has to get rid of the filibuster. If you look at what was able to be passed, it was because they were able to jimmy it into a reconciliation. So you need to get rid of the filibuster, and then what about adding states? If you look at our own history, this was used in the past. That's why we have 2 Dakotas, is because it was an arbitrary move, basically, to ensure an equal number of non-slave states and slave states. At that point, to support the Republican Party, these things need to be discussed as part of the reform agenda, and I'm not hearing them at all, so I wanted to raise them here.
Can I?
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Just very quickly, because literally last night I had the honor of representing Black Voters Matters. We got an award from DC Vote, because of our work in support of their work on DC statehood. So I want to give them a shout out. And to answer your question, absolutely. If we dealt with that issue, in fact, I tweeted it this morning. I said, as Senate was switching, if you're upset about that, keep in mind that DC as a state would give us 2 extra senators. So I just wanted to co-sign on everything that you said.
And follow Cliff on Twitter.
I mean, the Senate is a complicated issue. I think there are certainly ways to think about it. A lot of countries have reduced the power of their upper chambers as they've become more democratic, and there might be ways to think about reducing the powers of the upper chamber. I think we ought to have a conversation about both federalism and the Senate simultaneously, in which liberals and conservatives make a deal that the Senate gets less powers and states get more powers. I mean, federalism is a mess. There's a lot of overlapping, unclear jurisdiction. I think it's a challenging thing to do, right? For reasons. Well,
Or Florida.
But I might say that then you have to make sure that there are laws against state preemption, right? I mean but anyway, it's a conversation that we ought to have because there's a lot of unclear lines, and I think conservatives would say the Senate protects federalism, but does it really? We can also think about different ways to do Senate elections, I have a proposal that I'm working on that would be a 2-round Senate election in which there would be fusion balloting in the second round for parties that get eliminated in the first round. But it's doing away with you have to do away with primaries
So-
for that. But
Senate reform, absolutely. Viability, maybe a little low. I'm going to go to another question over here, and then one last one, and then you guys each get about a minute to wrap.
I just want to throw out a couple of more vague or general reform ideas and your takes, if any, on both the doability of these and the efficacy. Okay, on money in politics, corporate money in politics, I don't know whether this would get around Citizens United, but can we, well, first of all, is it legit doable to require all corporations that contract with the United States government to forswear making contributions? Second of all, is it doable to require that corporations have mass shareholder buy-in before they're allowed to make donations? And the other reform I wanted to ask about was, which hasn't been talked about, is nonpartisan redistricting to make more races competitive so that we don't have, 95% incumbent reelection.
Thanks for the question. Quick answer? Anybody want to jump in on redistricting?
Just really quick, redistricting, yes. I mean, I spend a lot of time in the Republican Party, and I will just tell you, on our side of the aisle, there was, in red states, immense resistance to it. And I'll echo what Maria and Cliff said. Like, what was my former party, the Republican Party, actively talking about trying to suppress the vote from black and brown people? Yep, I was in conversations. It's not even hidden. Like, that's actually happening. It's mind-blowing. It's 2022. And we're talking about, like, how do we keep people of color from voting because we know they're going to vote for the other side? That's horrifying to me. If nonpartisan redistricting picks up steam, we can do that. I think some of these other reforms are probably going to come first, ranked choice and other things. They just, in some places, they've got more viability. But as they start to break down barriers, it becomes more and more likely that you'll see that. But a lot of good court cases will get us there first.
Thanks. Lord?
Oh, somebody mentioned earlier that all good things in our democracy stem from the local level. And so, I mean, to your point about picking up steam, there's already a number of states that have independent redistricting commissions that are doing very good things. I mean, they're not perfect, and it's complicated. And you are getting a slate of elected officials who better represent the ideology of a state and who better represent the diversity, racial and ethnic diversity of the state coming out of independent redistricting commissions. I think that's particularly true in California and in a few other places.
Yeah, and before somebody has the chance to say that those commissions don't work, I will add that a recent study that we participated in last year actually found that states with commissions are statistically coming in at a B or higher on a grade of A to F, B or higher across representation, competitiveness, fairness, and those without commissions are rating at a D or lower in their redistricting. So there is making an impact.
There may be some selection bias there. I've looked very closely at what all the studies say about congressional redistricting and congressional redistricting commissions, and there's no doubt that independent redistricting commissions do better on partisan fairness, competitiveness. I mean, there's a fundamental problem that we have single-member districts, and Democrats and Republicans live in different places. So there's only so much juice that you can squeeze out of redistricting in order to make things fair. Meanwhile, there's a partisan problem, which is Democrats kind of unilaterally disarmed in a lot of states by supporting independent redistricting commissions, while Republicans pushed gerrymandering, which has probably hurt Democrats. So, that's a complicated issue. But the problem is not districting or redistricting. It's the single-member district. If you have single-member districts, you can't draw districts that are fair to both parties, that are competitive, that are that guarantee inclusive racial representation. These are all trade-offs. You just can't do it. I spent months looking through the literature, looking through the history. You can read the report that I wrote, what we know about congressional redistricting and independent commissions. We've just got to stop thinking that if we just have independent redistricting commissions, we'll fix everything. That's BS. I'm sorry. It's small ball. It really is.
Cliff, go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly, because I think these last couple of topics, the gerrymandering, redistricting, as well as the campaign finance. There's an elephant in the room. We're talking about fixing the Senate. We're talking about fixing the House. We got to fix the court. even as it just this week has entertained a legal theory, a fantasy around this. For those who don't know, this is the independent state legislature theory that would essentially eliminate all checks and balances in regards to state legislatures being able to do whatever they want on election policy. We've got to also, in this conversation, we've got to take a look at the court, whether it's gerrymandering, Citizens United, all of the voting, all of this, everything we've talked about in one way or another comes back to the court.
So Cliff, while you've got the mic, what should the people hear, the people listening, what should they do? And then we're going to go down the line as a closing. I'd like to just hear from each of you. How can people be involved in a way that'll actually make a difference? Because I think that's what we all want.
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, doing what we're doing now, right? Having these discussions, getting more informed about all of these issues, finding organizations that are doing good work on all of these issues, whether it's Fair Vote, Fix Our House, all of the organizations sitting at this table, but finding an organization that is really looking into all these reform issues and supporting them, get involved, supporting, whether financially or, time, treasure, talent, but and then getting involved in the advocacy process, calling senators, congresspeople, the White House, whatever, protesting outside of the Supreme Court, whatever you need to do, right? But I think there are all of these organizations that deal with this have a variety of ways that people can get plugged in and more informed and supporting with real action.
Thanks. We'll go Laura, Miles, Lee, and we'll end with Maria Teresa.
I mean, I think that's my answer too. I don't have a better answer to finding, the centers of power building in your community or in your, wherever you are, wherever you are from, that are made up of people that you care about being represented in your democracy. We're talking a lot about the United States, of course, and for us, that is people of color, low-income people, women, again, others who are excluded. So find an organization that is centering those people and throw down with them. And yeah, it might be like advocacy, it might be like making calls, et cetera. It might be direct action. It might be doing research. It might be coming with good questions for your audience and all kinds of fun data. But find your superpower, your organizing superpower, and plug it into somebody, an entity in your community that is trying to build this multiracial inclusive democracy.
This is going to sound a little weird. I'm going to say fast cars, money, and guns. And you're thinking, what the hell am I talking about? And I've got a point here. Fast cars. I purchased a very speedy, very dangerous vehicle without having to show up in person. I moved $1 million transfer for our organization a week ago without having to show up in person. I have a concealed carry permit that I got re-upped without having to show up in person. I can drive a fast car, I can move $1 million, I can carry a gun on me, and I don't have to show up. I'm talking about voter access. I can do all of those things, but I can't vote remotely. I think secure mobile voting is going to be one of those things that undergirds all the reforms we're talking about, because those fundamental democratic reforms aren't going to happen if we don't make it easier for especially disenfranchised groups who in a lot of red states, people are trying to keep them from getting to the polls. Okay, let's make it just as easy to do those things. And here's where that becomes really important to the electoral landscape. The largest voting bloc in America in 2024 will be Gen Z. And they think it's batshit crazy that they can't do this one thing remotely and in a secure, verifiable way. And by the way, they're the largest group of independents in the country. The majority of Gen Zers say they're not Democrats or Republicans, they're independents, and a lot of them are very moderate. So we need to give them a very, very easy way going into the future to actually vote whether it's ballot initiatives or on candidates.
Lee?
Well, in addition to going to fixourhouse.org and signing up for
Well
our
done,
campaign
well done.
for proportional representation, which Cliff and Miles are both on our advisory board, well, yeah, we're happy to join, happy to add you. Please, let's know if you're on board. You should.
I just want to say for the record that Lee is on my advisory board, by proxy.
No, but actually I have a very simpler thing, which is be a good neighbor. Because one of the challenges of our democracy in this moment, I think, is a lot of people feel really alone and feel really isolated. And politics and democracy are about building collective power. And we build collective power by building community. And we build community by being good neighbors.
Thanks. Maria Teresa?
I love that. I think that's right. I think that there's this, folks need community right now. So I will actually, am not aligned with this idea of voting because you could move money and someone can steal your identity and that money can go away and you're going to be fine, hopefully, because you'll be insurance. But if someone accidentally steals your identity for voting, that interferes in democracy and democratic systems. And the technology just is not there where we could have safe systems. We know for a fact that there were foreign interference attempts in 2016. That was just 6 years ago. We are not there. It sounds sexy and fun and Voto Latino. All we do, all of our voter registration is online. We can basically identify who we want, who we don't want. We're very good at this, and I can tell you from my expertise and my understanding of where we are, that is not, it is not secure. And that's exactly what individuals would want, to actually create fault lines for unsafe systems. And then all of a sudden you say, but I voted. And so I would encourage us to think about other ways of modernization. And then maybe not today, but in 15, 20 years we could be there, but not right now of the fast fix because Gen Z decided that they didn't want to get up that day.
I would just agree really quickly. We are not there, and so we have to make the investment. I mean, I was doing the 2016 election protection against the Russians, and you're right, they would love it if we did it now. So my exhortation is go invest your money in really, really good, innovative tech to make it happen eventually.
And Cliff's going to say something quick.
I'm just going to say real quick, Lee inspired me. The thing we can do is believe. I lived in Selma, Alabama for 10 years, right? I lived with, worked with, hosted a radio show with people that were directly involved in the Selma movement, the voting rights movement, people who didn't have the money and they didn't have a lot of stuff, but they believed. They have the audacity to believe that if we walk across this bridge, that we can get something done, that we can change this country. It starts with that belief, and then everything else flows from that.
That is a fantastic closing argument. Thank you. So we will do your question afterwards in person. We have to wrap, but I want to say I believe very strongly in the power of organizations like these, nonprofit organizations that are doing the work that is necessary to create change. And so I want to just do what everybody here didn't quite do, which is say Renew America Movement and the Forward Party is an organization you should check out. Demos is an organization you should check out. Black Voters Matter is an organization you should check out. Fix Our House, Voto Latino, and Represent Us. We are a small sampling of the incredible organizations across this country that you can be involved in. I want to thank you all for being part of the panel and for the incredible work that you do every day for this country. And this has been a real pleasure. If anybody would like to come up afterwards and ask more questions, we can, but we're on time and we've got to stop. Thanks so much.